Okay, so I wanted to talk about some of the questions on this progress check that were widely missed. So we'll start with the fishing techniques one. So we're looking at different techniques that can reduce the effects of overfishing. So we're trying to minimize the amount of exploitation of individual fisheries as possible. As you can see here, the correct answer is A, increased use of large mesh gill nets for harvesting salmon and trout. It's important to understand what a gill net is, so I wanted to show you a diagram of that. A gill net is something that they suspend in the water column and leave there for a while, and as fish swim through, their gills flaps get caught on it, and so they stay in the net, basically. So what the question choice is saying is having large mesh here instead of a fine mesh that's going to catch a lot of smaller fish as well. So having a large mesh gill net is going to catch just the target species rather than also catching a bunch of bycatch. If we're looking at the other examples here, greater reliance on bottom trawling in coastal waters for harvesting shrimp and sole. Remember, bottom trawling is the practice in which a net is dragged back behind the boat itself and it is weighted and it's down at the bottom of the seafloor. This is something that's really, really damaging to seafloor bottoms. This is examples of before and after on a deep coral reef. So this is a deep water coral that takes hundreds of years to grow and can live for a really, really long time. This is before and after trawling of the same location. As that net is dragged along the bottom, it is demolishing all of the stuff in its wake. Another example of that we can see in our next tab that is being blocked by Zoom right now. This is another example of a before and after of trawling, where you can see we have this diverse bottom community of a lot of different structures. We'll see a lot of fish hiding in and among those, and this has more diversity in it than what we see in the after photo, where it's basically just like a parking lot. So trawling is going to have a pretty negative effect on the ecosystem, and it's something that should be avoided. It's one of the problems with fishing strategies. If we're trying to reduce the harmful effects, that one is causing a lot of harm. The answer choice C, increased use of longline fishing techniques in the open ocean for harvesting swordfish and halibut. This is another one that often has a lot of bycatch. So with longline fishing, we're looking at a long line. They lay out this very, very long line that has a lot of hooks that are baited and set, and then they wait for things to get caught on it, and they don't check it consistently. They'll leave it for a while and then come back and collect all of these things. This has a lot of bycatch associated with it. You catch things like your target species, but there are other things that also get caught on this line, get caught on the hooks, and you end up getting a lot of stuff that you didn't actually want to catch. So this is another one where bycatch is a big problem. One other thing with the trawling in addition to the bottom damage, bottom trawling is also going to catch a lot of unintended organisms as well. When you have this massive net being dragged behind your boat, you're not necessarily selective with the things that you're catching. So you're damaging the bottom with this weighted structure here, and you're catching a bunch of things that you're not necessarily intending to catch. So bottom trawling, negative, harmful thing to avoid. If we have a large gill net, then we are minimizing the things that are getting caught in the actual gill net itself to the species that are going to get stuck in that size of mesh. All right, this one we're looking at soybean crops and the different pests that will damage it. We have categories of pests over on the left here. So clovers and dandelions and crabgrasses are different kinds of weeds. These are different diseases that are going to attack our soybeans. Cutworms and all of these beetles are different types of insects, and then slugs and snails are mollusks. So our question is asking, which of the following time periods are insect pests most detrimental to the soybean crops? So we want to look specifically in this row here and figure out when are insect pests harmful. If we're looking at the timeline of when the insects are even there, we have it starting in early May, and then we have a continuation of insect pests until we reach mid-September. The soybean crops are harvested in August, so this whole section here is going to be especially affecting the soybean crops, but we don't have an option that just leaves it that. So we're looking for something that is going to include our full growing season and also all of the time that insects are going to be there in that growing season, which of our answer choices, early May through mid-September is our best answer here. So our cutworms start early May, and we continue on having insect pests in these fields until mid-September. There are pests that are inhabiting our fields in most of the year, but if we're looking at insects specifically, we can narrow it down to this range here. If we're looking at mid-June through the end of August, we're cutting off that beginning part of the cutworms. If you're looking at when most pests are affecting, then mid-June would make sense because you're including more things starting there. But we only care for this question about the insects. So read your questions carefully as you're answering these. Which of the following statements best describes an unintended environmental consequence of aquaculture fish farm enclosures located in estuaries? So remember, estuaries are an area where freshwater terrestrial surface waters are meeting up with the ocean. So you have brackish water, mix of salty and fresh. And that reason alone is why we can throw out the first answer. That is not a potential drinking water resource. Estuaries have salt in them, and it's energy intensive. It's very hard to get the salt out of those. So we don't really use estuaries as a drinking water source. For cultivated fish breeding, it can change the gene pool, but having that increase in population size is not necessarily a major effect of these fish being around. When we're talking about fisheries are very, very widespread. They're large groups generally that have a geographic range that covers a lot of ocean, and a couple of fish escaping is not going to have a major increase on the wild populations. So it's the change in genetics that people are generally more concerned of rather than the population size. The other thing is increasing in population size is not a negative thing. Having the genetic change can be a negative, but increasing the population size, if you're looking at fisheries management, an increase in population usually is a positive thing because most fisheries are heading towards collapse. So we're looking for a consequence. It could be unintended, but that generally isn't what's happening. This one here, aquaculture enclosures harboring parasites, though, when you have these very, very densely populated enclosures, those are going to be more likely to harbor diseases. This is something that we've looked at in our population unit with density dependent factors. When you have a lot of organisms close together, they spread diseases between themselves quickly. And that can spread to our wild populations, which we don't really want to happen. It's not a good time. Okay, so best describes environmental damage caused by slash and burn farming. What slash and burn is exactly what it sounds like. Cutting down the plants that are there, burning the remnants of those plants. When that happens, you put in an initial boost of nutrients from that organic material, but it's usually temporary because you've used up all of that nutrient content that was there. And tropical rainforests are a fairly nutrient poor area because the nutrients are coming from the cycling of the things that are living there. So if you burn all of the stuff that was dropping leaves and was dying and decaying, if you do that all at once, you burn all of that stuff, you use up your nutrients, you use up your resources, and then that land is no longer useful for agriculture. It is not an area with traditionally nutrient-rich soils. So short benefit, but then after that, you used it up and you're not recharging it because you're just growing these agricultural crops that you are harvesting and not letting that organic material stay there and cycle the nutrients in it. When we're looking at the bare soil being exposed and becoming dried out, this is something that we associate more frequently with tilling because you are churning and you are exposing this area that was better at holding water and it dries out. That is also going to kill soil bacteria. In tropical rainforests, dry soils usually are not that big of an issue because it's a rainforest. So having dry soils because we're looking at a rainforest is pretty unlikely. That one you should associate more with tilling. As far as our other answers, they weren't commonly chosen, but I'll address those really quickly. Nitrogen and phosphorus enter streams and reduce the growth of algae. If nitrogen and phosphorus were to enter the streams, they would increase the growth of algae because those are fertilizers. We would see an increase. So if they entered streams, that would be a negative. That would be environmental damage potentially, but we would not see a reduction in the growth of algae. And then last, there's an increase in biodiversity as areas that were previously forested are converted to agricultural fields. Agricultural fields are generally monocrops where you have one thing that's being grown and you have a lot of it. So if you're looking at a forest that you cut down all of this stuff that was growing there after a long period of succession, you have a diverse habitat, and then you cut that down and replace it with a monoculture. So we do not have an increase in biodiversity. This is a dramatic decrease in biodiversity, since tropical rainforests are one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. So we're looking at a chart here about how many liters of water that are needed to produce foods. We have it in amount of water liters per kilogram of food, and then we have the amount of water liters per kilocalorie. So this is what is the mass of the thing, but you don't necessarily have the same caloric density in the mass as you do between foods. So we can normalize that by looking at the liters of water per kilocalorie. What's the bang for your buck in terms of how much water are you using, and what's the nutritional value of the caloric content of the food that you're making? So we're wanting to know which are the most sustainable to produce in order to provide the most kilocalories to the population while minimizing water usage. So if we're looking for the amount of water to produce a kilocalorie of food, we want a low number. We want to use very little water to produce that 1 kilocalorie. So if we see a high number, that means that we needed more water to get that same amount of energy content. So looking at our options, vegetables require 1.34 liters of water for a kilocalorie. Chickens are 3, so that's higher. We can throw that one out. Cows are even higher, 10.19. That requires a lot of water to produce a kilocalorie of food. We want to be sustainable. We want to minimize that. And then eggs, 2.29, that is lower, but the lowest one of those is vegetables. We want to use the least amount of water to produce a kilocalorie of food. So for this question, we're looking at the tragedy of the commons. Which of the following best describes the concept? The tragedy of the commons happens when you have a shared resource without legislation, without some sort of common set of guidelines for how to utilize and how to care for this common resource. So looking at A, which was our most popular wrong answer, resources shared by individuals such as the Ogallala Aquifer are highly regulated by legislation. So that highly regulated by legislation means that it's not a tragedy of the commons. While that may be a really rough thing for some people not being able to access it, it's not the tragedy of the commons because we do have a common resource, but it is being regulated. So this is not a tragedy of the commons scenario. Communities enacting recycling programs to reduce the amount of materials that need to be mined. This is not a tragedy of the commons. We're not looking at a shared resource being utilized in an unregulated way. Even if people are upset about taxes, that doesn't make it the tragedy of the commons. They may be sad, but it's not the kind of tragedy that we're looking at in this concept. And then the aim of large logging operations is economic gain rather than sustainability. Shared resources could become depleted. This is an instance where we don't necessarily have a commonly or a privately owned thing. We don't have a managed area or managed effectively. So this is a common area that has been logged extensively. We don't have any kind of mention of legislation or regulation of this resource. And so the exploitation of it is an example of tragedy of the commons. Unintended consequence of waterlogging. Okay, so waterlogging, remember, is when you have your soils that are completely saturated with water. The water table is where in the soil profile, so how deep is it before you get to fully saturated soil? If you are waterlogging your soil, you are raising the water table. You're adding a ton of water. And now that lower water table where the soils were saturated, you added more on top of that. So we have a higher water table. It is closer to the surface in terms of where your soil is completely saturated with water. If we're looking at decreased erosion, soil loss, this is not what we see. So flood irrigation, we do see erosion. We do see the movement of the surface soils because you put the water there and then you drain it out. So you don't have decreased erosion with flood irrigation. This is not something that's going to stop erosion. While the water's there, we may have soils that are not moving necessarily, but when they are let free, then you are causing erosion. You have a lot of this problem. This is not going to be associated with waterlogging. And then increased oxygen. This is the problem with waterlogging. We don't get the oxygen intake by the plant roots. They can't get it because they are underwater. So this is the opposite. This is a consequence associated with waterlogging in the reverse. They are not increasing their oxygen intake. The oxygen that they can take in is decreased because they're drowning, essentially. Okay, so for question 22, we're looking for ways to combat overfishing. We have a lot of fish species, fishery species that are overfished and are starting to head towards collapse, if not there already. And so we're trying to minimize that. We're trying to combat overfishing, protect wild populations, but still supply food for people. As far as approaches that are commonly used, we have some options. Reducing the limits on the numbers of commercial fish species that can be caught. So what this will do is open up other fish species to fishing. In order to sustainably manage a fishery, you have to have a lot of information about that population, its size, its reproductive habits, its breeding grounds, its range, its lifespan, its life history. In order to appropriately manage things, you need to know about it. And that takes time, that takes a lot of science, that takes a lot of data collection. If we reduce the limits on the kinds of fish species that can be caught, we are opening up other fisheries to potential overfishing, and we want to minimize that. As far as the trends in overfishing, I wanted to address something that is said sometimes of global fisheries will collapse by 2048. So there was a set of researchers that published a paper in 2006 looking at the amount of fisheries that had collapsed, the percentage of our commercial fisheries that had collapsed. In 2003, we were looking at about 30% of our fishery species that were collapsed. That idea of the oceans are going to be empty in 2048 is because they extrapolated that data out, followed the trend to see what would happen in the future. But these extrapolations, these continuations are based on maintaining the status quo of how we fish and how we manage fisheries. And so this is not necessarily true. We had limited data, we had limited information on different management strategies, and it just isn't accurate. And the scientists have since redacted that claim. And what we've actually observed is this. We have actually seen an improvement in the number of fishery species that are collapsed. We are fishing, instead of looking at how many fish are being caught, now we're looking at how many fish are out there. So the way that we measure data is different. The estimation of collapsed fisheries is usually based on when I go out, how much fish am I bringing in? When that is reduced by 90%, so when you're looking at 10% of the catch that you're getting now compared to before, that's when it's classified as collapsed. That doesn't necessarily mean that 90% are gone. It means that your catch went down by 90%. So now we've gotten more accurate data. We have more information about these fish stocks. We've done more data collection, and looking at the stock data, looking at what is out there instead of what is being caught, it doesn't look like that line that the original study proposed. So that is not necessarily accurate. We have gotten more information, we can better manage these fisheries, but we don't necessarily just want to open it up free range for whatever to be caught, because it takes that kind of management strategy, information gathering in order to appropriately do that. That's hard to do. That is hard to regulate. That is hard to legislate. And opening it up is not something that would be helpful long term. You can make an argument that if you're spreading out your fisheries between more species, you're taking fewer of any one, but we're trying to continue our ability to manage fisheries without starting to get to the place where we could potentially exploit new ones in addition to the ones that have been having some issues. For our other answers here, banning the use of a sonar as a means for capturing fish. Sonar isn't widely used for capturing fish in open ocean, and it's not one of the major problems with overfishing. So that wouldn't really fix the problem of overfishing. That's not the problem. Sound pollution is an issue. We'll talk about that in a future unit. But as far as overfishing, it's not really commercial fishing that is causing the sound pollution issues in the water. And then promoting fishing in estuaries and breeding grounds rather than in the open ocean. Estuaries and breeding grounds, now you're looking at getting adolescent fish, you're looking at getting the breeding stock that are there having the young, and you don't want that. If you're trying to maintain your population, if you're trying to keep the fish that are going to add fish to your population, you want to leave the estuaries alone. Don't go taking them out early. Don't go collecting the adolescent fish, the ones that have not matured, that have not had the chance to reproduce. You want to avoid that. So the size limitations on fishing are totally based on reproductive history of that fish species. You don't want to take out the breeders. You don't want to take out organisms before they've had a chance to breed. And so promoting fishing in estuaries is completely against that goal. It's completely against the aim of doing that. So avoid the areas where they're breeding, avoid the areas where the young ones are so that they can grow up and then be recruited to that population and add to our fishery to sustain it. And then this is kind of that same idea that I was just explaining in C, enforcing minimum size requirements for the capture of commercial species. You want to make sure that you have a specific size that you're collecting. You want to make sure that you are not collecting ones that can breed. You want to make sure you're not collecting the really young ones before they've had a chance to breed. So there are specific size limitations in order to help maintain the reproductive ability of this population. Those are where the minimum size requirements come in. I think that's the last one. Yes. All right. If there were any other questions that I did not go over that you would like explanation or clarification on, please feel free to come talk to me about it. Remember, I'm doing an extra help session before school on Friday. So if you have further questions about these things, please come talk to me, come see me, ask me at some point.